Hey, check it out, new background. Now I don't have to look at that horrifying old Victorian era yellow and brown wallpaper anymore. Bram Stoker is a famous gentleman, famous because it's his depiction of the vampire in his novel Dracula that makes up the basis for much of modern vampire lore. Did you know, however, that he also wrote other stuff? Stoker was actually a relatively prolific writer. He produced like 13 novels and a whole bunch of short stories and non-fictions. The one that we're going to talk about today is his less well-known and less, I guess, well-accepted Egypt-based work, The Jewel of Seven Stars. It is absolutely not his best novel by any stretch of the imagination, but at least, unlike The Lair of the White Worm, it's actually readable and decent. The story goes like this. Young barrister Malcolm Ross— why is it always a barrister? Are there no other interesting jobs for a young man in England? I suppose not. Is somewhat obsessed with this girl, Margaret Trelawny, whom he met at a party some time ago. And one day he gets a letter delivered by one of her servant people directly to his door at a sort of weird hour of the day, asking for his help, as he had promised that he would help her if she ever asked. Which is vague. Like, I don't know if it's smart to just tell someone like, hey, if you need anything, I will help you, when you literally met them at a party like that night. But anyway, he hurries off to her house, where he sort of finds out that her famous Egyptologist father, Abel Trelawny, has fallen into some kind of like coma-like trance state and has been injured as well, like lots of blood missing. And when he gets there, he meets basically the whole cast of characters at the time. There's Margaret, as well as a police superintendent Dolan and a Dr. Winchester, who were both called on account of the weird, like, strangeness of this thing. And it turns out that Abel made it worse by leaving a letter for his daughter that would only be opened should anything as weirdly specific as his falling into some kind of unconsciousness while in this room should happen. And as a matter of fact, he actually made it up with his lawyer to force the contents of the letter to be followed to the letter. So should he ever come to some kind of harm of this sort, I suppose, while in this one, he was to be left in this room, not taken anywhere else, but to be left in this room and accompanied 24 hours a day by somebody. The room is not great for like someone who is sick. It's pungent, it smells like bitumen and mummy dust and all of that, and it's full of these ancient artifacts, and under no circumstance is he to be removed from that room. So the doctor can't figure out what's wrong with Abel, but the wounds on his arm suggest to the doctor, at least, that Margaret's cat Silvio is the cause of the bleeding, which it tracks. He takes the cat's claw and scratches it across some paper, it leaves some marks, and then he compares the marks to the arm, and yeah, they match. Even though the doctor can't figure out what's going on, they set up a watch and like start taking shifts. And of course, because the story would be really boring otherwise, during Ross's watch, when he is with Margaret, he falls asleep, we'll charitably say, on account of the mummy vapors. And then when he wakes up a couple minutes later, he finds that Abel's body has been moved from his bed back to where they found it, where the pool of blood on the ground was only so recently. That happens to be in front of this big safe in the room, and he's bleeding again. So after a general round of freakouts, Margaret entreats the doctor to bring in a sort of higher level specialist, a brain expert, who should be able to tell everybody what is happening with Abel's being in a coma. When he arrives, he checks the scene out and then says, "You guys are dumb. Like, if you want me to figure out what's going on here, you have to move him out of this foul-smelling, toxic, vapor-filled room, because probably at least that is part of the problem that's keeping him in this weird coma, and that put him there in the first place." Margaret, of course, refuses because the letter said so. So the specialist tells him that if they want his help fixing this problem, they can call him when they have taken his advice, and then he just up and bails, which is sensible. Because if you call a doctor in and you're like, doctor, fix the thing, and doctor says step 1 is to do this very basic thing, and you refuse to do it, doctor ain't got no obligations to help you with your thing anymore, because you won't do the thing that you asked him to help you do. So I don't blame him at all, but apparently everyone else in the story does. They call him a jerk, and they're like, oh yeah, well, if he was a true, real doctor, he would be more invested in this case. Yeah, alright, you guys. Another night happens, and there's no attacks on Abel, but the nurse falls ill. So Ross had bought a respirator that he was wearing to try to keep the mummy dust out, but the person he was with, the nurse who was doing the watch with him, didn't have this, and she fell into a kinda coma too, which is left unexplained for the entire book as to why that happened. It could just be the mummy dust, but it's a little bit left unexplained. But in any case, no attacks on Abel Trelawny happen. But that night, a stranger shows up at the Trelawny house, another Egyptologist who is named Eugene Corbick, who worked with Abel Trelawny in the past, and was tasked with retrieving some of these special lamp artifacts for him. But when he arrives, he finds that the lamps have been stolen somehow. So he does stay the night, and the next day some exposition happens about some of the artifacts in Trelawny's collection. There is a 7-fingered mummified hand, a beautifully inlaid sarcophagus, and a weird sort of like metal coffer box covered with these hieroglyphics on it. And then later on, Malcolm finds the missing lamps, the lamps that Eugene had brought that somehow went missing. He finds them in Margaret's room, and we, the audience, can feel right now our suspicions toward Margaret that have sort of been cultivated from the beginning of the story are coming to fruition. And then there's more exposition by way of a conversation between Malcolm and Eugene, and a book that Malcolm is given by Eugene that tells the story of a Dutch explorer who finds the tomb of Queen Tara, wherein there is a sarcophagus and a 7-fingered hand with a magic-looking ring. Weird, huh? Almost like we're supposed to be surprised there. So apparently, having read this book, Abel and Eugene, 16 years ago or something like that, had gone to Egypt to find this very tomb, and luckily, successfully did so. You see that a lot in these stories. British guys are like, we want to find this specific tomb, and then they go to Egypt, and then they find it. There's a huge amount of space that you'd have to be so lucky to find in like a small amount of time. Anyway, we'll leave that to where it is. But they go and they successfully find this tomb, and they steal a bunch of artifacts, like, for instance, the 7-fingered hand, and the magic ring, and the sarcophagus with Queen Tara inside, and the coffer. And supposing that this Queen Tara was some sort of terribly powerful sorceress who'd plans to come back from the dead, she had magic powers and all that, this is important. We're gonna take all of it. So they literally, while they are doing so, lose not only all of the people that were working for them that had tried to steal the mummy's body from them while they were sleeping. They found them all dead. But they also literally lose 3 whole days of time in the blink of an eye somehow while in the tomb, like a magic time slip sort of thing, which is just more evidence to the awesome and terrifying power of the queen, I guess. Of course, and this is the most important part of this piece of exposition, during those 3 days, Trelawny's wife bore a child and died in the process of childbirth. But he did receive Margaret from that mortal transaction. So now, flash forward 16 years, where Abel has some kind of revelation that these 7 special lamps from the tomb might be the way to reawaken Queen Tara, whose body and artifacts they had stolen, and he's just got in his house. Abel now, in the story, finally wakes back up and is basically fine. No lingering side effects of having been put in like a mummy-induced magic coma or anything, but he apparently digs the idea that his daughter Margaret and protagonist Ross are into each other, which is another thing that has been happening this whole story. Ross has been, like, quietly simping for Margaret the entire story. And Margaret knows, and has kind of started to dig it herself. So they've set up this romance between archaeologist's daughter and barrister. An archaeologist's daughter starts acting suspicious pretty early in the story, and barrister is trying to be rational and logical about everything, but they've got this little spark of romance that is fine, I guess. It basically has to be in every Victorian mummy story anyway. More importantly, Abel is excited because now the lamps have been gathered. He intends to go with what he is calling the great experiment of trying to wake Terra from the dead. He's actually been preparing for this for like a long time. He has a house way out in the countryside set up specifically for the purpose of doing this ritual, which shows not only how obsessed he was with this idea of trying to pull her back from the dead, but also how stupid rich he was. I'm just gonna get a house out in the countryside that I can prep specifically for the ritual of raising the dead of a mummy that I also stole from my trips to Egypt. Eat the rich. In the original version of the book, there is a whole chapter called Powers Old and New that talks about how if Terra comes back to life, it'll sort of mess with the reigning religious theory of Christianity's superiority. And it discusses the philosophical and religious implications of a world to whom it is released, that the Christian God is basically fake, because now we have actual real proof of the older Egyptian gods, and have, as of yet, no actual concrete proof that the Christian God exists. And then it also talks about how Egypt might have actually been like super advanced in science and technology as well as spirituality, and kind of like mix the two of them together, which directly contradicts the imperialist Victorian agenda that states that England is in fact the best at everything and all other cultures are inferior in all ways. They actually cut that chapter of the book from the later printing because they are cowards. We don't actually know why it was cut. Bram Stoker himself was an advocate against censorship in literature, so the possibility is that if it was cut and he did it, and it wasn't like someone else's decision that he just had to go with or whatever, he probably censored it because it would have incited discussion that would have gone against Christian dogma, which Bram Stoker, as a Victorian man, was of course a Christian. Cowards. They all go out to this house in the countryside, and Margaret starts showing signs of possession or personality switch or something like that. Like, hitherto, Abel tells us the spirit of Queen Terra was confined to inside this mummified cat that he also had, that he'd stolen from the tomb, and it was her attempts to get to the special ring that caused his weird coma thing, and the wounds on his hand because Queen Terra was animating the mummy cat somehow, and slashed his wrist open and bled him all over the floor. But now that they're actually closer to doing this revivication thing, Queen Terra seems to be inhabiting the living flesh and blood body of Margaret instead. And Margaret straight up tells them that this is basically the case, which is both terrifying and strangely comforting, apparently, to all the men involved. There's a little bit in here where it's sort of implied that there was no Margaret to begin with. It's always been Queen Terra, like from the beginning. The whole loss of 3 days in the tomb during which Abel's wife had a daughter, and that was Margaret, is like the migration of the soul from the mummy into this baby who, because the mother died, the baby was dead too, we assume, and it was brought back to life when Queen Terra's spirit entered it, and it was probably only dead for like a second or two, and Queen Terra was just waiting for the vacancy in it to hop right on inside. So that is a theory as to what's going on there, which makes everything all the more sinister, because then that means that for years now, Queen Terra has been silently orchestrating all of this to happen from the inside, from the guise of like a demure Victorian teenage girl. Important to note that 16 years ago, they went to the tomb, they lost their 3 days and all of that, which implies that Margaret is like 16 or 17 at best, and this barrister, this full-grown-ass adult, is in this weird, like, two-way romance with her, and that's fine, I guess. They do set up the ritual. Conveniently, a horrible storm rages outside, and there's the upper level of the house, and then downstairs in this sort of cellar is where they're doing the thing, but there's still like cellar windows so that you can get to the outside if you needed to and all that. And so Malcolm, who is sort of opposed to the idea of doing this thing in the first place, doesn't want to participate in the desecration of the mummies and all of that, is given the job of turning on the electric lights after the experiment has been completed when they say, turn the lights on, because it has to be done in the darkness, save for these candles and these magical lamps that have to be lit. So he stands over by the light switch while the whole thing happens. And just as the lamps are lit, the coffer starts magically glowing, which I guess signifies that the ritual is being done correctly, or at least that something is happening. But then the storm shatters the windows, and then the smoke from the lamps goes everywhere, and then more smoke comes out of the glowing coffer, seemingly like entering the mummy's body, like Tara's body that they had just unwrapped a little bit ago. And then of course everything goes dark. Malcolm, who is faithful to his commands, waits continually for the command to turn the electric lights on. Finally, he gives up on the wait, and he sort of like fumbles around in the dark for a while instead of turning on the lights. Well, so finally he gives up the wait and fumbles around in the dark for a while, instead of, like a smart person would do, just turning on the bloody lights. And he finds the body of a woman that he assumes is Margaret's body. And she's unconscious but breathing, so he grabs her and brings her up the stairs into the dark house and sets her down, and then goes into a room to find some matches. But when he comes back, where he left her body, it's gone, and only the ceremonial marriage robe that Queen Tara was wearing and the ring with the 7 jewels in it are left there. And also, everyone, including Margaret, is dead downstairs. And that's the end of the story. Or it would be if there wasn't a weird censored reprint of this version. In the coward reprint of the book, they changed the ending as well, making it so that the ritual doesn't work and Queen Tara is defeated, and it's very anticlimactic. And then later on, a couple years later, Malcolm and Margaret get married, because we have to have a happy ending, I guess. Thanks, Victorian literature, for being kind of predictable, but that's the story. We are going to assume the position of the actual good ending and not this sort of like revised garbage happy ending censored version, because it's way more interesting that way. This is a full-length novel, like a couple hundred pages, so I had to, hopefully understandably, leave out a lot of details in the summary, but it is a doozy of a story to try to dissect. Foremost in the list of stuff to talk about is the same kind of imperialism that we've seen in basically all of the other stories that we've talked about. The entire chapter, Powers Old and New, that we mentioned a minute ago, the one that got removed in the reprint, is essentially an examination of how England might actually be wrong and what might be the result if that were the case. And I mean, England has just only recently figured out like what radium is, and figured out electricity, and like domesticated electricity, and like a bunch of other scientific discoveries, which should theoretically put them on top of the like hierarchy of countries and empires, right? Top of the food chain. But what if ancient Egypt, literally thousands of years before, had the exact same things, or perhaps even something better or more advanced? Here is the curious part, which actually struck me the hardest, right? They make a point in the book of talking about how there is no soot or oil residue in any of the chambers on the insides of these monuments. So keep that in mind when I say this next bit. The book was written in 1902 and supposes that Egypt may also have had access to electricity in some form. And then, 34 years later, in real life, archaeologists discover these artifacts that have been called the Baghdad batteries, which, if you're a conspiracy theorist, you will know has a huge amount of theory attached to it. But they're basically these like clay pots that are coated on the inside with like a metallic thing, and they act as galvanic cells that were probably used by the priesthood to electroplate objects. And while these artifacts are said to be dated from no earlier than like 150 AD or something like that, the fact that they exist at all is proof that electricity was, at least to some degree, understood by ancient peoples. When you fill the inside with like a mild acidic solution, it produces something like 1.1 volts of electricity, which is enough to do things like electroplating. And this isn't even to mention the fact that, like the story suggests, there are no traces of soot or lamp oil in these caverns, which would suggest either a meticulous cleaning of every last crook and corner and speck of the tombs, or a light source, somehow, which is non-soot producing. Something, maybe, like an electric arc light. Contrary to what we have about Atlantis, that is basically just, Plato saying that he heard something from another guy a long time ago, we actually have places from ancient Egypt to look at. And so far, no completely concrete evidence exists of this ancient Egyptians had electricity and lights and things theory, but it hasn't been disproven yet either, and it is both fascinating and possible that they had technologies that outdated the modern discoveries of them. There's also this idea of depersonalization of mummies and ancient human remains, right? We've sort of touched on this a little bit before, but it boils down to two questions. Does a human's body ever stop being a human's body? And if so, when? Like, when does it become okay to rob graves and display the bodies of those inside like museum pieces? How long ago does the body have to originate for it to no longer be considered human and instead be rendered from human into thing? This story goes even further in that exploration when, in the process of the so-called Great Experiment, Queen Tera, who is within the body of Margaret, admonishes the men who are unwrapping her pet cat, and then later her own body, for treating mummies like objects and not like the remains of living things. And obviously, should not the great queen be given respect, let not men unclothe her so, and like make it so that it's so sacrilegious. All to Margaret and therefore Tera's great displeasure at the indecency done to this great queen. But the men sort of just say, oh, it's a mummy. It's long since passed. It needs to be studied. This is for science. This is for the experiment. Messed up, right? Like if you ascribe to the idea that human bodies are somehow owed like an amount of respect even after death, and then just like willy-nilly drop them from that status because they died long enough ago, you don't really have a value for humans in the way that you say you do. This practice unfortunately was mega common during the Egyptomania phase of the Victorian era, with these like public mummy unwrappings, and like previously they would grind mummies up and use them for medicine, or they'd like burn them for fuel to power trains and all that. Like, it was common for them to be completely depersonalized and just used as commodity. And the fact that there is a character in the story who objects to the unwrapping of mummies is a step in the right direction, but we still have the collection of Egyptian artifacts in the National Museum in Britain to this day, so step in the right direction, you still need a whole lot to go. But if we're talking about Queen Tera, then we also have to talk about the idea of this sort of female liberation that keeps coming up. Queen Tera was a powerful matriarch, but she knew that those who came after her would very likely try to erase her part in the history of her kingdom precisely because she was female. In her reincarnated or possessed, body-swapped form Margaret, she knows that she has to play a very specific character in Victorian society to be taken any kind of seriously, and seems to resent the necessity to act demure and womanly, whatever womanly means. But once the experiment starts, all bets kind of come off. She objects to the indignity being thrust upon her female body, the violation of her bodily autonomy by the men who literally declothe her and display her. But she is not without her defenses against the institutionalized sexism that was strong when she lived in the first time and was strong when she came back. She has a liberation to her that sort of mirrors what was happening to what is called the New Woman in Victorian England at that time, and the wider Western world at large. They were looking for this liberation. They sought their own freedom from the sort of stuffy prescriptivism of the world of men. They wanted to be able to enjoy sex. They wanted to be able to have lives that were not just sit at home, take care of baby, cook dinner. There's something else to be remarked on in the idea of the significance of numbers, specifically the one in the title, 7. I mean, Queen Tara's hand has 7 fingers, the special ring has 7 jewels on it, there are 7 lanterns, the ritual is supposed to be done on the 7th day of a specific thing. Like, of course, if you were a numerologist, you might point out that 7 is a very specifically important number, and that in Jewish mysticism, it's one of the numbers said to be perfect. I bet that a more astute reader than myself, who actually gave a crap about numerology and all that, could note more instances of 7 in the story, and then it would be very interesting to do a targeted read on how many times the number 7 shows up. That's not me, but I feel like it's pertinent to mention that number 7 shows up quite a lot in the story. For intentional reasons, I'm sure. But can we also talk about this whole hot female mummy thing again? This is a weirdly recurring theme. The whole genre of Victorian mummy fiction is awash with this trope, and it's weird when you look at it through a modern lens. The idea of the mummy being this sort of like undead, horrifying monster notwithstanding, now, the idea behind it is rooted in this Orientalism trend that was happening, and the fetishization of the so-called Orient. So calling something exotic, for instance, instantly makes that thing into an other, which is problematic in a lot of ways to start with, but the Victorians loved looking at things from the East with an eye toward this kind of condescension and fetishization in the first place. They characterized the East as what it lacked from Western culture. For the first part, though, consider how weird it is for a living human to get turned on or excited in any way by a corpse in any state of decay whatsoever. If you're not into necrophilia, this is not the channel for you if you are, it should really gross you out, right? But like, they make a big deal about how pretty the mummy is when they unwrap her and display her body naked on the table. Main character Ross already has a weird romance dynamic with Margaret, the literal child, who is also the currently living version of Tara to begin with, so it makes it extra weird to know that even he finds the mummy to be beautiful. Like, I'm really glad that this trope has kind of died out and has been replaced with a different one, even though that one is also kind of a little bit problematic as well, but like, can we not? It's already bad enough that this whole Orientalism thing fetishizes the living women that come from these so-called exotic lands, but can we maybe step back away from the sexy mummy trope? No? I guess not, huh? I guess not until the end of this era. The main theme that you can explore with this one, if you were writing a paper on it, is the theme of the old versus the new, right? Like, old ways versus new modernization and science and all that, except this story actually gives it an interesting sidestep by suggesting that maybe the old might be more advanced than the new, and therefore superior by the logic of the new side. This idea is terrifying to the staunch English imperialist, but at the same time also very interesting because of the transgression that it implies. I mean, after all, if the ancient Egyptians had all kinds of highly advanced technology and stuff, then what else could they have had? Were the gods of Egypt actually real, and the entire ideology of Western theology is worthless because actual gods being proven to exist means that the claims of the Judeo-Christian deity are obsolete and false? You decide! This is a much longer story than we've talked about before in this little series about mummy stuff, but it has a lot going for it if you really want to do some serious analysis for interesting story tropes. I have rewritten this script for this video twice now, so this is version number 3 of this because it has been way too long to make into an easily edited video. So I hope that this smaller cut still rouses your interest. You can go and read the story. Like, it's in the public domain on the internet right now. You can find this story, like most of the ones that we've already talked about, in public domain access websites, wherever you like to get your books. So take an afternoon or two and give it a read. I'm interested in hearing what you guys think about it regardless. But thank you for coming and watching. I hope that this has done something for you. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, you can push the like button, put the thumbs up on it. There is a subscribe button. If you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, but you've already come this far into the video, why ain't you subscribed yet? You subscribe maybe, I give you more videos, you learn about literature things. Like, this is the first semester of what is 4 or more semesters of me talking about stuff. So if you're interested and you want to follow me through the whole thing and like gain some of the experience that I am having at university as well, like, hit that subscribe button. Maybe you will like it. I am doing other stuff too. So I have social media. I don't use it really that much anymore. The main place that you can really find me anymore is on my Discord, which is in the description box. I hope I've caught your attention enough to think that maybe you want to watch some of the other stories that we've talked about, which are in a playlist on my channel. Technically, this stuff isn't weird fiction because it's before the time where weird fiction was codified, but I still kind of put it in the same genre, like proto-genre. So maybe I'll make a specific Egypt-only Victorian fiction section as well. But so thank you guys very much, and I will see you next time.